Welcome to the Women's Health Podcast. I'm Marika Hart from Hemisphere.
And I'm Anthony Lowe, the Physio Detective. Together we interview leading authorities, answer questions and share our thoughts to provide the general public with the best quality information we can find on all aspects of women's health. Please remember that our materials and content on this podcast are intended as general information and for entertainment purposes only.
They are not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis or treatment. Now it's time to get cracking with the episode. So whether you're out walking your dog, driving the kids to school or just sitting back enjoying a glass of wine, we hope you enjoy the show.
Thank you for joining us on the Women's Health Podcast. We've got Hayley Shevener with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
No problem. Thank you, Mother. She had you. She did all the hard work.
That's true. She did. I have.
I thought today we could talk about pelvic organ prolapse, your journey, and one of the things that you raised up in the course in San Francisco, the female athlete course that you assisted on. Thank you very much for helping out on that. That was great.
Awesome.
One of the bits of wisdom that I loved you sharing was the normalization of pelvic organ prolapse and the language around it. Even raising the fact that, you know, you needed that diagnosis because there was this loss of I don't know who I am, I don't know, and it helped transition you, and you know, even holding it for a little while allowed you to process things and then move on from that. And, I loved all of that.
Great.
So I
don't remember saying any of it, but we'll get there, I'm sure.
Yeah, well, that's my job, is to try to draw it out, right?
Okay.
So tell us a little bit about yourself,
okay.
And tell us about your story.
All right. So I had a son about 4 years ago, and pretty straightforward pregnancy. There was nothing particularly interesting about it in terms of like physical stuff going on. I had a very long, pretty arduous labor, vaginal delivery, pretty, quote unquote normal. Very long second stage, long labor, but other than that, nothing particularly interesting. And was in a hospital that was the labor and delivery segment was midwife run, and so that was, everybody seemed to just be like, cool, business as usual, all seems fine. Carry on. And I went home having no idea what to expect and felt, I'm not sure, as I think most women do when they have their first child. There's a lot of stuff going on, but then I started to feel pretty good. And I was only able to take about 5 weeks off of work, and so returned back to work 5 weeks postpartum. As a personal trainer, which I had been doing at that point for about 10 years. And went back to the gym, was working with clients, and then started my own workouts shortly thereafter. And I immediately started training for a kettlebell certification, thinking that, that was a great time to do that. I had my son in February, and I believe the kettlebell certification was in October of that year. And to set the stage a little bit, I'd had a couple pre-postnatal certifications, and you can maybe hear the change in my voice because I don't think that they never necessarily certified me to do a whole lot, other than think that I knew what I needed to know without actually covering anything related to the pelvic floor. Or the abdominal wall for that matter. But I had these certifications. I felt like I was qualified to be navigating this own process for me. And so I went about my way and I started training for this certification, and around like 4 to 6 months, I started to feel just some discomfort in my tailbone. I started to experience more back pain than I'd had previously. Started to have some symptoms that I didn't necessarily attribute to this process of pregnancy and birth and postpartum, but just didn't particularly love what I was feeling and just felt this general sense of weakness. And I knew from, I don't know how I knew, but I knew that it was a good idea to meet with a pelvic floor PT. And so I did that and had an initial appointment right around 4 months postpartum, and it was pretty uneventful. Basically, everything seems relatively average. We were mostly focused on the tailbone, and there was a mention of, it seems like there's some descent of your bladder, but that was it in terms of discussion. And I didn't pursue that any further because I didn't particularly want to know what that meant. And I figured if it had been a bigger deal, it would have been brought more to my attention. And it just seemed like a kind of passing comment. And fast forward, I eventually did not end up taking the certification because I just continued to not feel great. And so continue on to about 13 months postpartum, and I spent a long weekend in LA, and I was with my son, and he would not sleep. And we were in a hotel. I was going to a fitness conference, and I decided to strap him on and do, I think I ended up doing about 2.5 hours of stairs with him, wearing him, which was tiring. And it was, we started at like 4 in the morning and just went up a like 30-flight stairwell again and again and again. Did that 2 times in a row. Didn't really notice anything at that point. But at the end of this particularly stressful weekend, physical stress, emotional stress, flying for the first time with a kid, I don't like flying anyway, I felt very distinctly that something was different and something was wrong. And it felt like things had just kind of sunk in my pelvis. And I felt a sense of heaviness, dragging, and at that point had switched over from running my own business to working exclusively with perinatal women. So I was working with people with pelvic organ prolapse. I was talking to them about prolapse. I was very aware of what that was. And so I immediately knew what I was managing, and the comment previously about this descent that I had been exhibiting made a lot more sense. So I went back and to the PT and got an immediate oh yeah, this is worse. This is definitely worse. I see what you mean. I see why you're having these symptoms. And that was all I remembered. I don't know if there was more discussion about what specifically was occurring, but my brain kind of shut off at that point, and then woke up again when I started to talk about what that meant for me. And being someone that was advising people on prolapse and thought I had a good understanding of it, I asked that question completely out of fear, because what I was telling people at the time was beyond conservative. And I had at that point only seen maybe 2 people out of my 40-person client load who said that they had prolapse. So I thought of it as extremely rare in a worst case scenario. And so that's where my brain went to, that, oh shit, here I am, extremely rare, worst case scenario. And I started talking with the PT about what she recommended, and it was, walking, if that felt okay, avoiding downhill walking, considering taking a car to get down from the hill after I climbed up the hill. I live in San Francisco, and if anyone is familiar with San Francisco, I would be taking 40 cabs to go to work.
Totally flat.
Extremely flat. And, so that in and of itself was enough to kind of, it was said, I think, in sort of jest, but it wasn't funny to me, and it seemed so pathetic to me that recommendation was made, and that it was kind of made with a smirk, and she knew it was a dumb idea, and she said it anyway, and that made me feel wow, this is so bad that someone can't even give me a better recommendation, and they're having trouble telling me what their recommendation even is. And it was, have you done, do you like swimming? Could you do that? Could you take that up? I don't and cannot swim, so no. and I did not particularly want to learn. Also, San Francisco, not exactly a like pool city. And then it was kind of like, well, you could do some body weight squats, and I asked about, how I should be implementing that, and it was kind of like, well, I think you could exhale, or you could inhale, or you could kind of play and see. It was very vague, and what it felt like to me was that this person was unclear of what to tell me, and because of that, I felt like, wow, I was so messed up and so broken that this person whose job it is to tell me what I should be doing can't even figure it out. And I left and walked out the door and was trying not to cry and walking home. Every time I'd go down a slight decline, I was just, terrified of what was going to happen next. And my symptoms intensified as the day went on, as the days thereafter went on, and they got to a point where it became completely consuming. And I was on Google trying to find as much information as I possibly can, which, I think it's a little bit better now when you Google, but I still wouldn't recommend it. And it was pretty grave. And I found myself on all of these websites and forums where everything was bleak and seemed that everything was destined to get worse. That was a very matter-of-fact statement, and I took it at face value because I didn't see anything to suggest otherwise. And I became immersed in surgeons and these websites that were kind of strange and also very, very depressing. And I would just walk to work on my phone reading through things, and that's kind of how I deal with a lot of things in life. I fill myself with as much information as possible. I'm the person where there's a horrible thing that's happened and I'm parked in front of the TV or looking at every news feed as it's refreshing, and so I just infiltrated myself with all of this trauma, and that was the only thing I could think about. And shortly thereafter, a lot of stuff started to unravel in my life, just absent or independent of this. My father-in-law died after a really long battle with cystic fibrosis, which was kind of amazing. He was 60 years old. But anyway, but he died, which was hard and obviously upsetting. And it was recommended to me that I might benefit from weaning my son. And that wasn't a recommendation that was suggested like you should do this there because you'll feel better, but it was mentioned as a potential thing, and so I had decided, was already kind of at that point anyway, but in the next couple months I started the weaning process, which was another thing that people didn't really talk about, the potential that I would have an emotional response to that. So I'm going through all of this emotional stuff, and my central focus is this prolapse diagnosis that is consuming. And my relationship suffered. I completely stopped doing all activity because I was terrified, and I felt like I felt symptomatic all the time. And that confirmed at the time for me that everything was terrible and that I was just going to make things worse. I would, in between clients, and sometimes even during clients, if I had to give somebody a 10-pound dumbbell, I would freak out and totally panic, and I would go into the bathroom and check and see what was happening in my pelvic floor, and I did that, I don't know, probably 100 times a day, to the point where it was just this constant checking and filling my feed with information that all confirmed that this was indeed the worst case scenario, and I felt like this would just be the trajectory that continued to occur. And if you haven't figured out by now, I tend to trend this way towards other things as well, and so this was not a shocking thing for me, but I had any control over what I was feeling, both physically and emotionally. And I didn't know who to talk to. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I didn't want to talk to my husband. I didn't want to talk to the people I worked with because they too felt like, oh yeah, prolapse. Oh, that's so sad. And that's so crushing. I'm so sorry. And this just devastating thing. It was hard for me to participate in Facebook groups around this topic because, again, worst case scenario kept coming up. It was like, oh, these are some things you might experience postpartum, list, diastasis, urinary incontinence, and then, hopefully you don't get prolapse, but that is something that can happen. And then, who knows where we are in timeline, roughly 16 months-ish, I saw that you were coming to the Bay Area to present your course, and I signed up for that. And you also noted that you were doing some one-on-one time, and I booked into that. And I had been familiar with your work and the work of some other people that were talking about prolapse and other issues in a slightly different way. And that was exciting for me, and that was kind of this glimmer of like, maybe there's something that I can get from this, but I also just kind of believed that it wouldn't apply to me because I had such clear signs that everything was always going to be awful. And so I went through that course, which was great, and then I think a couple days later we had an initial session, and I don't really remember, that's not true. I remember telling you about how I was feeling, and I remember you asking me questions and not really leading either way. And I had such a clear feedback from the PT that I had seen in terms of like, oh yeah, this is definitely this is really bad. Like that was very clear to me. And when I was talking to you, you didn't give me anything. And I wasn't really sure what that meant or where that was going, but I was curious, and you were doing a bunch of things, and I was like, I don't know where this is going, but okay, seems nice. And so we then eventually got to moving. I don't really remember the segue from like being in the room talking about stuff to moving, and you were just kind of bringing me through some basic movements that I've done for years, step ups and squats and hinging and lunging and things like that. You had me do a push up and things like this. And I remember thinking like, well, this is pretty standard, and this is some pretty basic stuff, like, but you gave me permission to try it in different ways, and had been very rigid. I had been very rigid previously in terms of technique and what something should look like and how it should feel. Even if it didn't feel good on my body, I still had to do it that way because that was the right way. And you gave me a couple things that you were like, well, you could try it this way and see what that feels like. And, the next thing I remember from that day was the cab ride home, and just feeling this sense of hope and like lightness after having felt like I was kind of living in a cave up until that point. And like suddenly I was like, wow, look, the Golden Gate Bridge. We were in Marin across the bridge. I was like, oh, it's so beautiful. I just had this feeling of things are going to be okay, maybe. And that maybe was such a huge difference from how I had been feeling the previous months. And it, one of the things that you said was to go back into the gym and to start playing around with things, because my goals were all related to wanting to get back to strength training, wanting to work back up to working with kettlebells and all of these things that I'd felt like were never going to happen for me. And so that's what I did. I think I did that the next day. And I just started to play with some really basic stuff, and I felt mostly okay, maybe confused that I felt mostly okay, but I felt mostly okay. And I continued to try, and I continued to feel mostly okay. And it kind of just had this domino effect from there, and I started to feel a little bit more comfortable playing around with things and going back to some movements that I had tried before, or that I had tried before that hadn't felt good, and they started to feel good again. And I took that as permission to continue on that process, which is a process I'm still on. And yeah, it's I find that people ask me, what did you do? What was the most helpful thing? And I think what they're asking for is like, well, I did 3 sets of 10 Kegels and I held them for 5 minutes, and then I did some hypopressives, and then I did some of this, really linear like rehab program, and I really didn't do much of that. I'd had a pretty solid base. My pelvic floor had tested pretty well for the most part, and so my particular issue was not necessarily a significant strength deficit at the time. And so, I mentioned that because for some people that more beginning process is going to be really important. That wasn't necessarily my next step that I needed to take at that point. And it really was that I changed the way that I thought about things, and that I changed what it meant to me and what I felt comfortable exploring, and who I felt comfortable talking to, and I would start to explore movement, but I also started exploring just being more open about what I was going through. I started a Facebook group called Pop Fitness about people wanting to return to exercise, managing prolapse, and I just started to open my possibilities, and it made a massive difference. Who'd have thunk it? That's kind of the how did I get from the very beginning to the diving board in a sense, where I could jump off from there and start to kind of explore how I wanted to swim, although I cannot swim again. Still not swimming, but metaphorically swimming, and figuring out how I wanted to go from there.
Yeah, it's if I can speak about what I was thinking during that consult, was it used to be in the course, foot in the door technique with you. Because, when you said, this is pretty standard stuff,
right.
I could feel that. But it was very much, I just remember thinking, okay, she's really worried about these things, and so, checked your coordination, checked your contractions, tested you, testing okay, let's get you up. We got kicked out, do you remember? Because Deanna had a patient,
sure.
She needed the room,
right.
So that's why we ended up in the courtyard doing all the step-ups and the lunges and the...
Worked out.
Yeah, it worked out really good, because it was I had to find that stuff anyway. And it was just allowing you time. To me, it was the same process with small stuff.
Sure.
And then bigger stuff, and then bigger. And I remember on the step up, I remember some pushback that, but it's not right to do it this way. And I remember saying, but how do you feel? It's like, well, I feel better doing it this way. And it's like, well, then that's okay. And just that, that confusion and that
right.
working it through, that really stands out in my memory.
Right.
And that's when I thought, yeah, okay, she's got it. I got it there.
Yeah. Which is so interesting, because I think what I'm thinking right now is kind of important. I don't know if it's going to come across, if it's just in my head that it sounds important, but I don't remember what you had me do. I don't remember the adjustments or the modifications or whatever. I don't remember any of the shifting that we did. And that to me is relevant, because it suggests that we weren't looking for right, we were just looking for something different. And had it been the right answer, I think I would have remembered it, but I have no recollection of what the shift was or what I had been doing before, or I don't know if either of those things would feel better or worse for me now, which I think is very exciting and liberating, and also really confusing for a lot of people initially, and especially people who are kind of working through this process in the very beginning, and kind of having to navigate it maybe on their own a little bit more as well.
Yeah, and that is the process, right?
Right.
Because I would have put it on you
Right.
to tell me what something different is.
Right.
And then, okay, let's try that.
Right.
Whereas most of the time, and I think you referred to it, is that you're looking to the therapist to
Right.
give you direction, to give you the answers. And,
Right.
and you tend to remember that because you remember what they said. And,
Right.
whereas you're like, I don't remember what we did in the session because you came up with the stuff, and
Right.
it would have been confusing at the time.
Right.
One of the things also that, in talking, what I would love for you to go through what some of the standard common pieces of advice. You've already told us some, but some of the standard things that you hear in the pelvic PT world, in the pelvic health world, pelvic organ prolapse world, that might need challenging, or at least questions asked about that. Like, what's some of these common things that people are often told that may not be as true as what they seem?
Yeah, so before I will even talk about what the exercises are, I'll talk about two words that I think we could perhaps get away from. Always and never. Always exhale on exertion. Always lift your pelvic floor when you blah, blah, blah. Always do this, that, and the other thing. And never hold your breath, never strain, never get to a point where something feels challenging, never sit up again, never, etc. Any time something is always and never when we're talking about an individual spectrum, I think that should raise a big red flag. And I've always felt that way, but in this particular thing, and I think this is true for a lot of people, both going through this experience and also trying to coach other people through it, we kind of leave all of that nuance behind. We suddenly are identified as prolapse, and then, okay, well, the rules don't apply anymore. There aren't any considerations, it's just what it is. And then things like no wide squats, no, there's a website that referred to them as man push-ups. Just a standard push-up with a fully extended knee.
Yeah. I call them harder push-ups.
Yeah, sure.
Push-ups on your toes.
Just push-ups and sit-ups, crunches, weightlifting, lower body weightlifting, which I always thought was kind of interesting. You'll see the recommendations where it's like, if you're doing upper body stuff, that's fine, allegedly, but if you're lifting weights and working with your lower body, then suddenly it's not fine. Running, impact, basic things like picking up a toddler, baby wearing. I could make a 600-page list on all of the things that over the years I've heard and read. But those were some of the big ones that stood out for me. Definitely no kettlebells, and it was always, the website always said kettlebells, which was like, okay, so you're not even sure what the tool is, but we definitely know that it's wrong. Barbells, anything that resembled, basically if I wanted to do it, it was on the no list. And the like okay list was always yoga, Pilates, maybe Pilates, that's a little dicey. Swimming, everybody loves swimming, walking, maybe. And that was pretty limited.
Not up a hill, right?
No, not down the hill. You can go up the hill, but you gotta take the cab down.
So you gotta take down the hill.
Yeah,
right.
yeah. And, which, like, to talk about the downhill thing, like, I can laugh about it now, but I did feel, and I understand why some people will feel more symptomatic going downhill.
Absolutely.
There's more impact. Potentially, if you're,
tension.
You put yourself in a different position, you have to brake. And, these hills are steep too. It's not just like a gentle kind of slope. It's like you're like climbing
San Francisco.
down. And so it just confirmed, whenever I would have an experience that, if I did a push-up, for instance, and if it didn't feel good one time and I had seen that was on the no list, then it was like, oh, well, right, obviously. And, the wide squat thing, or like lateral lunges, which quite frankly have never really felt great for me and my body. I would do one and would be like, yeah, this doesn't feel so good. And then it was like, oh, well, right, because of this thing. It was on this list, like, geez, you could have just read the list and you would have known that. We get very boxed into these lists, and, we believe that the list will keep us safe. And so, of course, we want the list. I think that at times I've been very frustrated by the fact that this list exists, and the fact that we're subscribing to this idea that we need to outsource our intuition and our experience in our body to something that some random website says, that, by the way, is not attached to any research, and definitely not research that applies to me. But I understand why we want the list. Like, I wanted to feel safe. I wanted to feel like I was doing the right thing. There's so much attached to the idea of prolapse that suggests that you caused it, which was really the biggest thing for me. It wasn't so much the physical thing. I didn't really care, quite frankly, what my vagina looked like. It didn't really look that different to me. I was like, whatever. The symptoms were bothersome, but what was the most upsetting was the shame that was attached and the feeling that I should have known better, and that if I'd done things differently, I would have been able to avoid this, and that therefore it was my fault. And that was the thing that was so hard and detrimental, and that made me so emotional about it. I don't know how we got there, but yeah, the lists are problematic.
It's a nice segue, because I was going to ask you about, like, you talked about the feelings, and we've talked about your story to the diving board, and you know, you've launched off into the pool that you'll never swim in. Yep.
I can doggy paddle maybe.
You'll stay alive long enough that someone can come for you.
Sure.
But how from that point, how did it go, and how were you made to feel exploring, while still, you know, because this is 3 years ago, still having the majority of the pelvic world still very conservative and restrictive, and not even with the evidence that that shows. How were you made to feel, especially because, you know, you're not a physical therapist,
right?
So of course, what would you know?
Right. I felt like the perception was that I was reckless, and at times I internalized that, and I felt reckless. I felt like I would feel okay, and I would feel better, and sometimes I would have an influx in symptoms one day, and you know, I would go down that thought spiral of like, oh right, you're going into treacherous territory, and you know, you better watch out because you're just kind of asking for this. And I felt like I was, sneaking. I felt like I was 16, sneaking out of my house, walking down a back alley, and going to buy some drugs. And that at any point, my mom or the cops were gonna show up, and I was gonna get busted, and I was gonna go to jail, and it was just gonna be this whole thing. Like, I felt like I was doing something wrong. And I felt like I couldn't talk about it initially, and I didn't really initially start talking about it on social media until a little bit later, because I felt like people were just going to look at me and say, well, you know, you'll just wait and see. Here, you know, you can do that now, I guess. If you want to take that risk, then go ahead, I guess. But that's not something I would do. And you know, that attitude of kind of like, wow. Or on the other hand, I would get this like, wow, you're really breaking the mold, which is the same statement, just in a different way. It was this idea of like, this is so obscure and so out there that you know, that I was doing all of these things that, you know, I mean, they weren't even that interesting or impressive to me in terms of what I had been doing previously or what I would want to do, but they were so different from the standard, you know, sit on the stability ball with your 5-pound weights, and you know, make sure you exhale at the right time, because otherwise, you're setting yourself up. And luckily I was working, at that point I had seen Deanna, who we mentioned, and she had been really affirming and she was very like, oh yeah, like, seems pretty good to me. Like, it was just very nonchalant and borderline blasé in some ways, which was exactly what I needed. And might not have been what somebody else in that situation needed, but I really needed someone to be like, looks fine, carry on. And that, I really resonate with that. And she was exactly that for me, and she was really encouraging, and I would see her a couple more times, and we started to work towards what I ultimately wanted to do, was do do the kettlebell certification. So I was really lucky that I had that support, and that I could engage with you. And you know, fortunately for me, this was roughly around the time when the discussion of prolapse started to shift, and I would end up finding a couple people, like 2 or 3, who had, they'd gotten back to running, or they'd also started doing some strength training that was, contrary to the typical recommendations. So there started to be there was a network that was building, and so I wasn't the only one. But I felt like it was negligent if I posted on my social media, and I felt like it was setting me up for people to kind of side-eye me, and especially the PT world, which I was really, I looked up to the PT and still do in many ways, and felt like, I'm just this lowly peasant trainer, and like, what do I know? And how could I possibly have any idea on what's happening here? And I have to appease and make sure that the PTs I am talking to know like how much I'm thinking about this, or that I've been working with someone in person. Like, I felt like I had to prove that I was eligible to be doing these things.
Justify yourself.
Yeah, I felt like I had to justify myself on every thing I said or posted, or I couldn't just move and be done with it.
Yeah. And so to bring that story full circle, what happened with that Russian kettlebell thing?
It passed.
Yeah.
I crushed the shit out of it.
And it wasn't just like a level 1 course, right?
That was first the level 1, and then I went on to do level 2. But I did the level 1, and I emailed the instructor. It was really important for me to let the head instructor know that I was managing this thing, and that I wasn't looking for an excuse. I wasn't looking for any kind of special treatment, but I was looking for the first just getting it off my chest, so that it wasn't just I was going to walk in there nervous, and then it's like, okay, we're jumping into this thing that I may not have felt comfortable doing, and then I was going to have to figure out what I was going to do. I wanted to give him a heads up beforehand, and just said, like, I am fully committed to having to fulfill all of the requirements for the test, and I'm not asking for any kind of special interest on that, but just so you know, if there's a time when maybe I'm feeling like I'm a little bit fatigued and I want to step back a little bit more, I'm going to go ahead and do that and take ownership of that process for me. And just in case you notice that, like, I'm okay, but I might need a break. And kind of set that up, and he was really supportive, and was like, I have some basic knowledge of what this thing is, what prolapse is, and you know your body best, and take what you need. And like, in case people don't know, there's a stigma attached to the Russian kettlebell world that it's very macho and Russian, and that it's very like, you'll do this, and if you don't do this, then you're not going to pass anything, and it's very like, and I was aware of that, and there's a high fail rate, and it's supposed to be this like really difficult, physically challenging thing that even fully, what I had perceived as fully capable people, which was the box I didn't put myself in, it's supposed to be difficult even for them. And so, for someone like me, it's going to be really difficult. And and he was just basically like, look, we're trying to get away from that image of having this be such a like difficult physical task, and make it more about coaching certification, which is what the actual certification is supposed to enable you to do. But it's got a 5-minute snatch test. You have to be able to demonstrate all of these technical skills that were all on the no list: overhead pressing, goblet squatting, Turkish get-upping, swinging, snatching, all of these things that were definitely on the no prolapse list. But I finished the snatch test before anybody did. I had like almost 2 minutes to spare. Everybody else was like huffing and puffing, and I was just kind of walking around, which is not a competition, but I felt a little bit of pride about that.
All the same weight, right?
Yeah. Men and women are different, but so. But
you were doing the same as all the other women.
Mm-hmm, yeah. And I did really well on all of the technique tests, and I basically whizzed through the weekend, which I was not anticipating. I went in just wanting to be able to say that I did it, And then I had no problems passing it. And I would go on to do the second level as well. No problems passing that either. I felt fatigued, just like everybody else felt fatigued. But I didn't have this influx in symptoms that I was expecting to have. I went to the gym the next day and was just super pumped to go swing more kettlebells, and so that's what I did. But I went into that certification knowing that it was really important to me and that I was willing to, quote unquote, risk the potential that I could make everything worse. And I took that on and did it knowing that, and knowing that I was open to that outcome. And it was not the thing that happened, which was fortunate for me. But I think that with deciding to do things that matter to me and deciding that I was going to be more vocal about what I was doing, I was taking ownership over my story, my body, my choices, and bringing myself back to the autonomy that I had been giving up in looking at the websites and in looking for someone else to tell me what was okay for me to do. And I'm a very independent only child who does not like to be told what to do. And I had forfeited a lot of that autonomy, which was crushing and was so different than what had been the case previously. So getting some of that back and continuing to take that on and learning the different ways that means something to me was huge.
Yeah. I remember thinking, when I read about the certification, I remember thinking, oh, this is good. Oh, this is good. This is a good challenge, and it will really let you know just, because it was challenging. And I remember you saying, I've decided to do this. I know this is going to be a challenge. And
yeah.
I remember cheering.
Yeah.
That's awesome. For women out there who are searching for information on prolapse and they're suffering, we hear many
Some
people.
of them are suffering.
We hear many people are suffering.
Sure.
We hear many people are looking for information.
Sure.
We hear many people are like, I don't know what all the fuss is about because I've got nothing. I'm only here because someone told me to be here. What would you say for the broad spectrum? See, because there is no, you've got prolapse, therefore you will feel this, this, and this.
Yes.
What would you advise them as somebody who continues on your journey with prolapse?
The more I learn, both personally and professionally, the less advising I feel comfortable doing, and the more asking I am interested in doing. So I don't like blanket statements that are either framed positively or negatively. I've really struggled, language is important to me, and I've really struggled with, I had a very visceral reaction to you saying suffering. And I have a very visceral reaction to people, what's an example? Oh, also the idea of you don't have to live with this. And I can kind of clarify that in a second. But I feel like I don't want to attach any meaning to somebody else's story that isn't theirs to have. And it was so important to me to be able and to continue to be able to tell what I'm feeling without being told what I'm feeling or what I should be feeling. And so I'm really interested in just starting discussions and saying, here's what the research says in terms of prevalence. Seems to be incredibly common. Here's what it actually is. Here's what's happening. How are you feeling about it? Why are you feeling that way? What led you to feel that way? And really starting discussions with people. That's not necessarily the most scalable, billboardable message, but I think that we have to understand that we have to ask questions before we assume that everyone who has prolapse is suffering or that everyone who has prolapse is fine. or that they even know about it. I want people who are discussing this topic on a like social media platform or in their group exercise classes or working one-on-one with someone in a PT scenario. I want them to be more curious about it and dictate less about what it ultimately must mean. Because they're, you know, in the Facebook group I have, which has almost 4,000 people, and through the process of, you know, having a course attached to this as well, like I'm talking to thousands of people, and their experiences are so different, and there's such a range, and the common bond seems to be that they want to be heard, they want to have someone talk to them about what they're feeling. They want to be validated in their experience, and there are going to be people on both parts of that spectrum that, you know, for some people they are suffering. They're really suffering, and it's hard for them to get through the day. And then there are other people who just couldn't be less bothered by it at all. And I don't think there's a one message that applies to everyone.
I think, respectfully disagreeing, it sounds like your advice is to keep asking questions.
Sure, yeah. Keep asking questions, but I also feel like maybe some people should stop asking questions of themselves. You know, sure. I think that we get to, there's a very fine, I don't think it's a line, it's like a squiggly thing that maybe resembled a line at one point, but it's, I start to get nervous when I start to talk to people who have so many questions that that are looking for either something that's going to make it go away or something that's going to make this experience not, something that's going to solidify what is happening. They're looking for closure in the actual entity of prolapse, not necessarily in how they're feeling or processing prolapse. And those tend to be the people, this is a huge generalization, but they tend to be the people who have so many questions, and they feel like those questions are, you know, it's like grasping for straws. And so sometimes it might be appropriate to ask fewer questions or different questions. Or, you know, to have them be asked questions themselves. Questions are good generally, but not always.
Sure.
You know, like everything else.
Yeah. Always avoiding the always and never, right? See what I did there?
Yeah.
No, fantastic. Thank you very much for your talk, and we're going to get you and Anne-Marie on to talk about your program and to talk about, you know, this I suppose is like the first part of the journey that led you to find people and then produce a resource for women with pelvic organ prolapse.
Yeah.
Where can people find you on social media? And they can discover the program for themselves, but we'll definitely have you back on with Anne-Marie about that.
Yeah, they can find me on Instagram at Haley Shevener, Facebook, same thing. I've got a website that no one goes to, HaleyShevener.com. And probably somewhere else, some random YouTube thing, maybe some random Google search that I don't know about. I'm sure there are all sorts of things, but those are the main things that they'll find. Yeah, that's going to be the first place to find me. Yeah. Beautiful.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate your time. Yeah. I always learn and get reminded of great things. I love your insights, and yeah, I think what you've done to promote a holistic, you know, a holistic healthcare message for women has been sensational and truly appreciated. And I know many PTs around the world really do worry but also have stopped to think and listen because of your message. So
Yeah. I want to say one more thing.
yes, ma'am.
Often when I tell this story, what I start to get nervous about is that someone listening hears it this way. They hear it in this sense of like, everything sucked, and then I stopped having symptoms. And I want to be really clear, because I don't always have the opportunity to say this next part, that that's not necessarily what happened or what is still happening. And that as I've gotten farther from the initial shock and awe of diagnosis, and as I've kind of meddled in different things and gone through different things in my life and whatever, as I've expanded my understanding of myself and this process, I want to invite the idea that you can have symptoms, you can have bad days, you can have bad weeks, bad months, you can have some shit happen, and it can still lead you to making a podcast like this. I think that most people read my stuff, hear my story, hear some podcasts or interviews that I've given, and they assume that I don't have bad days, that I never had a bad day again, that I don't sometimes find myself on Google, that I'm just fine, everything's good, I do whatever, and I'm chill, whatever. And that's not true. And I say that not to be like, well, hey, what about me? But I say that to suggest that that doesn't have to be the case, because there will be people that listen to this and that have read some of my stuff, and they'll say, well, yeah, but I still feel badly, and I'm still kind of feeling in the thick of it, and so therefore this doesn't apply to me. And I would suggest that the biggest thing that I did, the biggest change that I made, has been how I decide I'm going to look at it and how I see things from here on out. And that part of that has been opening up the possibility that things could get worse, and that things could get irreversibly worse, and that something I could do could make things worse. And I've come to a point now where I can be okay with that as well, which is kind of the 2.0 version in my story, that it's important to me that part of it exists, because I think we all want the happy story. We all want the person that says, and then I got better and I never had symptoms again, and la-di-da, everything is roses and sunshine, and I'm just sitting in the park and smiling all the time. And I don't think that that's realistic for any chronic condition like life. And there are going to be, peaks and valleys, and this. What's been really fun for me is to be more open to all of that, not just the success story and the hashtag woohoo prolapse. So I just wanted to leave on that note, which hopefully is well received and not taken as a oh geez, where's this going? But I think it's really important, because we'd like to talk about the idea that you went to PT, you got all your symptoms fixed up, you went about your life, you do all the things you like, and then you never had another problem, and it never came up again. And when people start to go back to what they love to do, and then they have that first instance of, oh, I'm having symptoms again, they freaking panic. And what has been really nice about the time that I've had, 4-ish years to kind of play around with this, is that every time I get to that point, I panic a little bit less. And that has expanded my range and allowed me to feel differently and explore more in more meaningful ways, and not just having the and then everything was fine. So, I think that a lot of people get left out of the rah-rah success story and the happy face emojis, because they feel like they don't belong there based on their symptoms or their presentation or their experience, or the fact that they are still struggling and suffering. And it's really important to me that we are inclusive in this conversation, and that it is realistic of the fact that there are going to be those people, and that's at some level going to be okay.
100%.
Yeah.
It's a real journey, and it's not just a linear.
No.
improvement till success.
Yeah.
And, you know, thank you for reminding me
It's all right.
that's what I should have asked about.
That's okay.
Are there any other? Like, I know we could do this for hours, right?
Yeah, that's good. That feels better to leave it on that note and to allow for the diversity of experience, not just in the various people, but in your own experience.
Yeah, meeting people where we're at. I know Marika and I feel really strongly about that.
Yeah.
It's about, well, what does our clients want?
Totally.
Well, what are their goals?
Yeah.
Where do they want us to help guide them towards?
And that's going to change.
100%. And that timely reminder that, you know, it's okay. You're going to have good days. You're going to have bad days.
Yeah.
And we're here for you no matter what.
Yep.
You know, so fantastic. Again, thank you very much. Really appreciated your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Alright, I'm going to leave that
Did
running.
you get it?
Geez, I hope so. Oh. Did it record? Well, that's it for this episode. Please be sure to hit like if you enjoyed this episode and leave any comments or questions below because we'd really love to hear from you.
If you haven't already hit subscribe, please do so now so that you can be kept notified of when we release a new episode.
Otherwise, thank you for listening and we look forward to having you back with us for another episode of the Women's Health Podcast.